The biggest problem with language learning historically is people go to classrooms or they used apps, but all they got was a lot of vocabulary that they memorized and they weren't able to talk out loud. And that's why the company's called Speak. If you're learning a language with another person and you're asked to say something out loud, you're going to edit yourself a little bit because you don't want to sound dumb. You don't want to sound silly if you really mess up the accent. This is the first time that people were really speaking a language with no one else in the room, and they loved it. If you offer regular classroom setting education versus one-on-one mastery where you're learning by doing, you will get 2 standard deviations above, so 99th percentile if you go the one-on-one route.
Welcome to Subversive, a podcast dedicated to sharing stories from the best consumer subscription apps in the world. We'll bring you lessons for how to grow your consumer subscription business, including insights and inflection points that led to exponential growth from leaders at category-defining companies and innovative startups. Let's get into the show. This episode is brought to you by RevenueCat. The world's best apps use RevenueCat to power purchases, manage customer data, and grow revenue on iOS, Android, and the web. Join more than 100,000 apps that are already using RevenueCat to grow their businesses and track more than $10 billion in spend, including category leaders like OpenAI, Notion, and Ladder. Learn more at revenuecat.com/subversive. My guest today is Connor Zwick, co-founder and CEO of Speak, an AI-powered language learning app that recently raised its Series C at a $1 billion valuation. In this episode, I talked to Connor about how Speak built an AI-native product that helps learners practice real conversations from day one. We also discuss how Speak achieved breakout growth in a crowded category, why the company went all in on AI voice early, and what it's learned about building consumer trust and maintaining long-term subscriber retention with a product powered by LLMs. All right, welcome, Connor, to the Subversive podcast. I'm really excited to have you on today to talk about Speak, which is the hottest new language learning app making the rounds around the tech scene these days. Lots of people talking about Speak and how it's using AI to make language learning easier and better for a lot of people. Before we jump into it, though, would love to just hear a little bit about how you see Speak and how you would describe it to people who maybe haven't heard of it yet.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Phil. So Speak is trying to build the best way to learn a language to fluency. And the way we do that is by offering an AI-first approach where you can practice speaking with our AI teachers instead of real teachers. You're free of the embarrassment. It's available whenever, wherever. And we have a superhuman memory of every mistake you make, and every lesson's made just for you. So in many ways, the biggest problem with language learning historically is people go to classrooms or they used apps, but all they got was a lot of vocabulary that they memorized and they weren't able to talk out loud. And that's why the company's called Speak, because there's billions of people out there trying to learn languages, and we're trying to solve that.
Yeah, it's certainly a great name. And you didn't specifically mention Duolingo there, but I'm sure we're going to talk a lot about them later in the episode. Before we jump more into Speak, though, would love to just talk a little bit more about your background. So my understanding is you launched your first startup, Flashcards Plus, when you were still in high school, eventually sold it to Chegg. Tell me a little bit more about that journey and what inspired you to be an entrepreneur so early in life.
I think for me, it was always just more about building. I remember in high school, I discovered the iPhone had just come out, and I'd been learning how to program just to build things. And I just found that to be a fun thing that I was just really curious how to do as a kid. And once the iPhone came out, I was like, well, I should build an app. I was a student at the time, so solved my own problems. I noticed that all of my friends in school were using those note cards. It kind of looked like an iPhone sideways, and I built it. I had no idea about growth and distribution, but it was early days of the App Store, so it was good apps just kind of rose to the top, and then it just kind of took off, and the rest was history.
Yeah, I mean, those were the good old days where there were so far fewer apps that growth and distribution didn't matter as much. Certainly looks a little bit different these days, although AI is creating a whole new tech wave that's creating new growth opportunities, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. So after high school, you go to Harvard, but you drop out to join the Thiel Fellowship. Tell me a little bit more about what gave you the courage to take that leap and what that experience looked like for you.
Once I kind of had the exposure of flashcards in high school, it was on my radar of maybe not going to college. And I actually, the day after I graduated from high school, I moved out to San Francisco. There was a VC that was trying to invest in Flashcards Plus. And I was like, I'm 17. No, thank you. I don't really want to take an investor on this side project of mine. And they were like, just fly out anyway and just spend the summer here. And so I spent the summer in San Francisco, and I was kind of on the fence about, whether to go to college at all. And I had a miserable time because I was literally like, I just turned 18 and knew nobody in the city. So it was like kind of lousy. And I went to school for 1 year. And during that year, I loved school. It was amazing to like just be able to just spend time learning and meeting a bunch of really cool people. But I just kind of had this like nagging feeling that I was leaving something. I ended up not going to class ever and just building things. And I started to meet people that were in tech, and they were all, in San Francisco. And so I actually ended up coming out like all the time, like every other weekend for something or another. And so by the end of the year, that's when I had heard of the Thiel Fellowship and I applied. This was like the second year of it. So it was still relatively new. I think it kind of gave me the push to do it. I'm not sure if I would have dropped out without it. I think I might have. But what it really offered was like a community, I think, more than anything. And that ended up being like the insanely valuable part about it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, you talked about how when you first moved to San Francisco, one of the big things that was missing was you didn't know anyone there. And so you have this miserable experience. You go to college, you have a great community there, but you miss the allure of building things and being an entrepreneur. And so the Thiel Fellowship, it sounds like, provided both. And so it was a great fit for you. And one of the people you met in that community was Andrew Hsu, who ended up becoming your co-founder at Speak. So what did that relationship look like? And then to transition into the primary topic for today, what inspired you guys to start Speak in a category like language learning where there were already some pretty large incumbents?
I met Andrew through the Thiel Fellowship, and I think that community was there was a lot of self-selection that went on. So it was a really interesting crew of people, and we were both kind of at a crossroads at a similar time. I remember one of the Thiel Fellows in my class was Chris Ola, who went on to be one of the co-founders of Anthropic. And even back then, I think he was one of the first people that I remember. There were several people in our class back in 2012 that were talking about deep learning. I had never heard of it before. And it still kind of felt like this crazy concept to me. They were talking about neural networks. But then over the next few years, you'd hear about like how all of a sudden image recognition was actually really good now with neural networks. And you started hearing about some of these releases. And so when we were at a crossroads, I had sold Flashcards Plus. I was thinking about what was next, and Andrew had done something similar. We both were getting really excited about what was happening in the research side. And so we decided we were going to dedicate a year and a half to just trying to learn as much as possible about AI. And this was back in like 2015 or so. Back then, there was actually a ton of activity. It felt like a really big deal at the time, but it was a much smaller community than it is today. And we were fortunate enough that, we lived in the Bay Area. And so there were 3 places that were publishing papers. It was Google, Stanford, and Berkeley. Google locked their doors. Stanford and Berkeley didn't. And so we just snuck into these courses and kind of learned as much as possible and tried to implement all these papers. And one day we built this the speech model system, and we trained it over the weekend off of a bunch of YouTube data we scraped, and it like beat all the state of the art records on accent detection. And
Wow.
That was when we started to think about, okay, this could be immediately useful for something that feels really important, which is empowering a better educational model. And that was kind of the groundwork of what ended up turning into the vision for Speak.
Got it. That makes so much sense. I was a double major in college. I studied economics and Chinese. So I spent almost half my time in college in Beijing and other parts of China. And, Mandarin is maybe an outlier when it comes to this, but with Mandarin, your pronunciation is so important because you have the different tones and inflections. And so you could say the same sound, but with the wrong inflection, and it would mean something totally different. And sometimes that can get you into a lot of trouble. And so as somebody who's used Duolingo for a long time and, and generally likes the product, I can see how, while it's a lot of fun and while you learn a lot of vocabulary and some basic sentences, ultimately, if you really want to speak the language and be immersed in it, you got to speak. And so it makes sense that there was this sort of gap in the market, at least at that time. I mean, at this point, Duolingo has launched Max, which does include immersive language learning and speaking. So we'll come back to that. But let's stick with the origin story and those early days of Speak's formation. It sounds like you and Andrew were initially playing around with lots of different applications of deep learning, and you sort of stumble onto this application of a model that helps with language learning and pronunciation. What came next? How did that lead to the formation of Speak as a company?
when we saw how powerful these models were, we had this kind of moment of clarity where we could envision how more training data, more compute would lead to better and better models. And we could see, at first, maybe we could just build a better model for understanding speech, but eventually we would be able to build a general solution for building like a full end-to-end tutor. And we were really fascinated with this idea of building AI systems that felt like you were building a relationship with another person and enabled you to improve yourself through education. It was a concept I think both of us found to be extremely compelling. And we became convinced that it would be possible to build something like that over the next 10 years. And that was basically the vision for the company. And so we started with language learning mostly because we saw this validation that we could start with a technical niche, if you will, which was just being able to understand people who were speaking with a strong learner's accent. And so, Duolingo existed back then, but they didn't have a lot of speaking. Rosetta Stone existed back then. They didn't have a ton of speaking. And the reason was because the error rate for the models that they were using was probably like 80%. Like it just did not pick up any of the words that people were saying. And so even just by being able to start with that, we saw that could be the initial wedge to building a product with more distribution, more data, grow the company, get more compute, train better models, and just like continue that flywheel until eventually we have the scale to build, the superhuman tutor that we thought was always going to be possible.
Well, and you mentioned there that you all had the foresight to recognize that over the next 10 years, you could build a product into this trend around AI that would allow humans to learn a language by speaking with an AI. But you were pretty far ahead of your time at that point, or at least from my standpoint as a layperson, it feels like you probably were. And so I guess there are two directions I want to take this. One is on the human side. How did you validate that humans would actually be comfortable speaking to a non-human as a way of learning a language? And what were some of the steps you took to validate that? And then I want to get later to the technical constraints you faced that early on and how you got around some of those constraints until the technology caught up to the point where you could do everything you wanted to do.
In the beginning, it was a bigger question of whether or not we'd even be able to pull it off, whether or not we'd even be able to build a model that was accurate enough to be a pleasant user experience. But after we had kind of gotten to that point, I remember testing in the early days with users, and all we were doing was trying to find people who were in the Bay Area who like could not speak good English because that was like the market that was clearly the biggest opportunity, and then test how the experience felt. And something we learned very quickly is that if we were in the room testing with them, it was very different than if we gave them the product to try on their own. And that was like a really big aha moment for us because we quickly realized one of the biggest benefits of speaking with an AI is that there was no fear of judgment. And it's something that people really underrate, but and you're not really even conscious of it. But if you're learning a language with another person and you're asked to say something out loud, you're going to edit yourself a little bit because you don't want to sound dumb. You don't want to sound silly if you like really mess up the accent. And so this is like the first time that people were really speaking a language with no one else in the room, and they loved it. And so that was like a really early signal for us that, okay, there's something here that is fundamentally different than what's kind of existed, and there's a real there.
Yeah, I love that. And I happen to have had Natalia Castillejo on the podcast last year, who's director of product at Duolingo. And she talked about with the launch of Duolingo Max, how they observed a lot of the same things about how people were more willing to take risks and to stretch their language abilities a little bit beyond their comfort zone that they might not do if they were speaking with a human teacher or even a human peer. But that was many years later. And so it sounds like you guys came across this insight much earlier in the formation of your company. Was there a tipping point in the metrics or in the progression of the product where you really saw this start to come to fruition in your data, right? You have these anecdotal examples of people in user interviews talking about how much more comfortable they feel learning a language with an AI, speaking with an AI. But when did it really start to show up in the numbers?
Speak is really a story of like several major step functions over time, and they've continued to kind of unlock growth on the metric side. One of the really big moments of inflection for us was really just building our first phoneme recognizer, which is basically a phonetic model for understanding the actual sounds you're making, which is fairly early on in the journey, and rolling that out in the product and being able to give people pronunciation feedback that was actually like reliable and accurate to the individual phoneme, and being able to like coach them on how to sound better. And immediately when we launched that, we saw basically like the entire funnel get substantially stronger as a result. I think another obvious big moment was when LLM started to get good enough that we could start to enable real open-ended experiences. Because for the first few years of Speak, the language modeling side was quite weak. We were really good on the speech side, but we were not so strong on the language model side because language models were just quite bad. And so we couldn't give open-ended experiences. Everything was very structured. We were like very early to the game around launching something, a role play feature, which is something we're very well known for, where you can kind of practice any scenario, and there's a whole suite of features around that. When we launched that was another moment that was that completely changed like long-term retention, DAU/MAU, and time spent in app in really interesting ways.
Yeah, well, one of the things I love about what you're saying is I think a lot of outside observers tend to look at a company's trajectory and just assume it was this straight or exponential curve up and to the right. But in reality, it's often these jolts, these leaps forward that come from core product innovations, which in your case sound like they were often quite technical, right? Changes in models that made the core language learning experience much better, whether that was the phonemes that you talked about or the language model getting better. So let's talk more about some of the technical challenges that you faced early on in Speak's journey, and then how those challenges have gotten easier or what new challenges have been created by AI over time. You launched conversational AI well before most other consumer apps. What were some of the hardest parts of doing that before some of the LLM technology really caught up to where it is today?
A challenge that we've been facing from the very early days of the company, as being an AI native company and building a lot of features on non-deterministic or probabilistic models, is the idea that these models do not work 100% of the time. And this is actually not really a technical challenge, but I think it's an interesting one. And that I think something that Speak has become very good at, and a lot of companies now are coping with over the last few years as they become more AI native, is this idea of like, how do you build really great product experiences on a model that works 90% of the time, 95% of the time, 99% of the time? It's a very different thing. And how do you like kind of test the product and make sure it's good enough? How do you think about the failure cases? It's also very different if you know it's failed versus a hallucination that you there's no way of knowing that it's hallucinating while it's happening. I think it's also a fundamental challenge because most AI products are still human in the loop. In other words, they're actually helping humans become more productive in something versus fully replacing humans for a service. And Speak is very much in the second bucket, right? There's no human that's like checking what's happening in the experience. And so understanding and building reliability there, and then also understanding what's possible versus what seems possible with a demo, but then actually in practice isn't a consistently good enough experience, is, I think, like one of the defining core challenges we have been facing since the very beginning.
Well, the probabilistic thing makes a lot of sense. And I can imagine, especially for new users trying Speak for the first time, if they're in an interactive session with an AI and they're learning their language and then it just sort of hallucinates and goes off in a strange direction, that would really undermine trust. Any funny stories in the early days of customer support tickets where somebody wrote in with, what is my AI teacher talking about?
Well, there's definitely a lot of sensitivity around even how you moderate the models. We were the first company to use GPT-4 in production. We were like 3 or 4 months before OpenAI released it in ChatGPT. We were kind of like the guinea pig. And I remember testing it with 30 power users, and we gave it to them, and we checked back like 3 days later, and one of them had used the product. I think they had used it for an average of like 8 hours a day for the previous 3 days. And we were like, okay, there's clearly something wrong with our logs. Something's like not working here, because there's no way that anyone used our product for like 8 hours a day for the last 3 days. And it turns out it was a person that basically figured out that they could use it to simulate the person being their like boyfriend. Yeah, and that's what we became really freaked out. we were like, okay, we've always kind of known that the ultimate way to engagement is, to fall down the slippery slope. And so we added all this moderation, and we were really like afraid of, maybe there's going to be a controversy where someone would have a screenshot of Speak that would go viral, where the, tutor was doing something totally inappropriate. And it turned out actually over time, the much bigger risk was the opposite. And people were actually offended that it was censoring them, or they would have these very specific scenarios. And so we've actually over time had to really dial back that moderation. And that is like a really kind of interesting challenge that obviously we're not the only ones that face.
That makes a lot of sense. Well, and I guess another question I'll ask is, how many languages were you supporting when Speak first launched? I assume it was a smaller number of languages, and then over time, you've probably opened up to more and more languages. So how many languages did you start with? How many are you supporting today? And were there any particular languages that were most difficult to get right?
Yeah. So the interesting thing about Speak is that we made the crazy decision early on to not just teach English, which was by far like the biggest market that we saw. There's like 1.5 billion people trying to learn English around the world. But we decided to focus on a specific language, learning English from, and we decided to pick Korean. And so for like the first probably 4 years of the company, we were exclusively focused on building product market fit for a consumer language learning app in South Korea, which is a place that me and my co-founder had never been before we started the company. The challenges with that were kind of obvious, right? Like, first of all, South Korea is kind of famous for being a market where Western tech companies like really struggle to gain a foothold. On the other hand, what we saw was it was an incredibly competitive market, but a market where people were absolutely obsessed with learning English, and all they cared about was efficacy and whether it would work. And so in many ways, it was like the market where we would get the most signal on whether or not our product was actually working versus just, effectively engaging them. That was the only language pair that we focused on for a very long time, and everyone thought we were really crazy. Fast forward to today, over the last few years, because of how much better our AI systems have gotten, we've been able to rapidly localize and expand to many languages. So now we support, we teach English to, probably 12 plus first languages. And we've launched a bunch of new languages over the past year. And we now support, you can learn 5 different languages on Speak as well.
What are the 5 languages, just out of curiosity?
So it is Spanish, Italian, French, Japanese, and Korean.
This episode is brought to you by Paddle. Today's fastest growing apps are multi-channel. They use web monetization to reach new audiences, improve attribution, and boost margins. But selling on the web gets complicated fast. Managing currencies, taxes, fraud, and disputes gets increasingly difficult as companies scale. Paddle solves this. As the merchant of record for thousands of apps, including Runna, GoodNotes, Codeway, and HubX, they take on the complexity of web monetization so you can focus on growing your business. Learn more at paddle.com/subversive. And what made you decide to start with Korea? Was it the fact that you thought it would give you the most signal because it was such a difficult market to get product market fit in, or were there other reasons that you chose Korea in particular?
So in the early days of the company, we did not have a market in mind, and we did a lot of different things to figure out which market to go after. We did market research, and we tried to analyze the market opportunity. We actually traveled to a bunch of countries to talk to users. And when I was in Korea, it became apparent just how much of an obsession the country had over learning English. There was a crazy stat back in the day. I don't know if it's still true, but they were spending 1% of their GDP on learning English.
Wow.
And if you like drive down the street in Gangnam, like the downtown financial district, there are like literal entire skyscrapers just dedicated to English classrooms that people would go to after work or after school. It's like a national pastime there. The problem is like there's also, it was by far the most well-served market, which is actually the thing that we were looking after. So basically, we realized that ultimately the bet for Speak is that we could build a 10x better product. And the only way we would be able to rise above the noise in a market like that would be if the product was actually truly differentiated. And so that's ultimately why we set our sights, which made our jobs that much harder, but I think set us up for, a much more kind of long-term road to success.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, you hear all the time that it's important for startups to focus. there's the whole Paul Graham dig deep wells quote, right? You can't afford to go broad and deep at the same time. And if you're a startup, you have limited resources. So you got to go deep and find product market fit in one place. What I haven't heard as often is actually taking the approach of making it harder on yourselves in a way by going to a market where the bar is very high, but you know if you can clear that bar. I mean, there's certainly a lot of demand. So that was playing in your favor.
Right.
But the level of expectation was very high. And so almost like I live in Boulder. And so it's almost like all the Olympic athletes that are here at the Olympic Training Center in Colorado Springs, right? They're training at altitude because then it just makes their lives that much easier when they're actually in competition. And so you spend the first 4 years focusing exclusively on teaching Koreans how to learn English. At what point did you decide you were ready to expand to other languages? And to what degree did advances in AI technology make that easier?
The second market we launched was in Japan, again, teaching English. And I think it was a culmination of two factors that coalesced. The first was that we felt like our product market fit was strong enough. We felt like we had advanced the product. We had enough, we had stability. We knew the core foundations of our pedagogical method, the technology platform, the fundamental product offering was all now very robust, and it was working. And we had a very clear vision for how it would progress from there. And that happened kind of in a very similar timeline to the ability to use LLMs to localize and much more quickly build our curriculum, which is a huge investment we made up front for Korea. And that was also possible to accelerate that. And so going from one market to two markets, I think this is the classic playbook problem, but we discovered all of the things that we didn't anticipate, and then we were able to automate a lot of that, and then rapidly go from that second market to many markets over the following year.
Got it. It makes sense. And then I assume from there, once you figured out Japanese, then you could quickly move on to the next set of languages. And it feels like over the last few years, you guys have really crossed more into the mainstream. I'm hearing your company's name come up a lot more often. You recently raised your Series C at $1 billion valuation. And I imagine that as that's happened, obviously building an incredible core product experience sits at the center of everything, but you've probably had to invest more and more into figuring out your growth strategy. So what has that growth strategy looked like over the last few years? And are there any particular channels that have been most important for you?
Again, I think the interesting thing about Speak is that we got pretty far in Korea before we started exploring in other places. And so we developed a fairly comprehensive playbook in South Korea that involved a mix of organic channels like PR and earned media and owned social. We use that to create flywheels into performance marketing, especially with creatives. And in Korea, we also piloted an influencer I consider to be a part of that. But in Korea, we really think about it as a brand building exercise. And so we've developed, we're the number one brand in South Korea for English education with like a 30 or 40% top of mind, 70 to 80% aided awareness. We've had about 10% of all South Koreans try the product at this point. And essentially all of that playbook of like a very integrated marketing approach is what we have now kind of copied and pasted in Japan, in Taiwan. We launched in the United States a few quarters ago. So here in Europe, and we're trying to kind of now parallelize it across all of the markets. And we really believe in in having a pretty integrated approach when it comes to the consumer growth side.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it's great that you were able to hone these playbooks in Korea that it sounds like have mostly translated to other markets. But as somebody who has led international expansion at a couple companies, I worked on it at Quizlet and then again at Fair. I know that sometimes things don't translate. And so were there any particular aspects of your product experience or your growth playbook that didn't work as you moved from Korea to Japan to your next set of markets?
There are definitely small parts that didn't work. I think again, because we started in Korea, we had this weird thing where our first market was international expansion in effect. And that was a very weird trait of the company. And so in many ways, when we went to go turn on the second market, we'd already been burned so many times with lessons around how to do international expansion that I think we did not have any naivete left in us. And as an example, we we didn't even try to do international expansion in Japan by hiring a team in San Francisco to do it. We immediately went to build a local team, and like we had a head of Japan hired on day one of launching Japan, because we very quickly realized the importance of doing that for Korea, especially for consumer. And then frankly, I think that insight is very much to your question of us realizing that the strategy needs to be incredibly local. There are many, many different things in every single market that are very local, and we try to empower the local teams to have like a framework to operate within, but then be able to operate fairly autonomously, so that the brand in many ways feels like a Japanese brand or a Korean brand or what have you.
Got it. And so it's sort of this hybrid approach from what I'm hearing, which is pretty consistent with a number of the companies that have done international expansion best, where you have a local team, whether that's country manager, GM, and then you've got probably people working on community, people working on user acquisition. But then you have your headquarters in San Francisco, and you sort of got your core technology team that is building things in the product that can provide tailwinds behind all of your international expansion efforts. But it sounds like most of the actual brand building and acquisition is happening in market. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And we see an opportunity to build a very lean central team at this point, because we're in so many different spots to build centers of excellence around specific functions, but very much like a core value of the way that we believe you need to distribute a product like Speak is to have to be very local.
Yeah. Well, and for a language learning tool in particular, it makes a lot of sense that you would want to be immersed in the markets you're expanding to. Another question I'm curious about is how the costs of AI have impacted your growth and monetization strategy. Because I assume that you have non-trivial underlying costs that you need to support effectively these AI tutors that are serving your learners. And so how has that influenced decisions around organic versus paid acquisition? And how has it influenced decisions around pricing and trial strategy and paywalls?
I think that tools that are more directly aligned to productivity, where like per token of usage, it's extremely correlated with value. Those are the tools that I think where you have the most cost pressure. I think with our product, especially because it is primarily a premium subscription product, we are fortunate to be able to have a lot more breathing room around our margin, which has been, very critical for our strategy of trying to be really on the bleeding edge of things. Ultimately, the long term, one thing that we try to really stress to our teams is the belief that all of these costs are going to go down over time, and to try to be as unconstrained as possible. Like if we ever suspect that teams are constraining themselves around cost, we try really hard to like dispel that. Because if we see any amount of ROI, even if the costs don't immediately feel correct in terms of the amount of ROI, it's a fairly reasonable assumption that those costs are going to continue to trend down over time, and we'll be able to develop even more product value over time. And that's like the general framework and discipline that we've tried to have up until now. But I say that with, I think the fortune of, again, not having nearly the same margin pressure as like, the agentic coding companies or what have you.
Right. Well, it sounds like part of the reason that you don't have the same margin pressure is because, one, you have an aspirational product with a high price point, and so people are paying a good amount of money to access your subscription. But then two, the amount of compute required to support your learners isn't at the same level as some of these productivity tools you're talking about. And so that leaves you with more margin. Is that right?
Yeah, that's it. Like the token consumption for this versus a workflow tool tends to be a lot more economical. But that being said, multimodality is very compute expensive, and like everything we're doing around speech is very non-trivial. But again, the costs are just trending so downwards over time that we try to make it as much of a non-factor as possible.
So I think that's a good transition into the last topic I wanted to talk about before we get to our lightning round. And that is how you see AI impacting the way people learn languages or even learn other subjects over the next 3 to 5 years. And particularly in light of the fact that these AI costs keep coming down faster and faster. So how do you think AI powered language learning evolves over the next few years? And what steps is Speak specifically taking to sort of set itself up for those tailwinds?
Yeah, I mean, this has been the vision of our company from day one. The core belief is that AI can enable a superhuman teacher that's not a real human and is scalable to everyone in the planet. And the core thing that is really being offered is true one-on-one mastery-based education. There's a very famous study in education science that's the Bloom Two Sigma effect, which is essentially the idea that if you offer regular classroom setting education versus one-on-one mastery, where you're learning by doing, you will get 2 standard deviations above, so 99th percentile if you go the one-on-one route. And I think this is like a universal truth in education. Everyone knows it's possible. It's just not feasible to offer it to people. And so it's really just the gold standard for the people that can afford it. And so I think this is clearly the inevitable future. I think at this point, it doesn't sound nearly as crazy as when we started the company, that's going to be possible in the future. I think basically everyone believes it now. But I think the thing that people don't appreciate is how different that is than the general AI assistants that we have today. Because ultimately the workflow of being a great teacher requires so much more than an AI assistant chatbot. It requires a real mastery system where you're understanding what someone knows, what someone doesn't know. It also requires pedagogical planning, which is a really hard problem. Andrej Karpathy is working on a similar problem. And I remember hearing a podcast, I think it was Darkesh's podcast, where he talked about how hard this problem is. And it is one of the core competencies that Speak is very focused on. And so there's a few of these areas: mastery-based, mastery evaluation, pedagogical planning, and then like dynamic generation of curriculum over time are a few of the core problems here that I think are very much like open research problems that we're tackling and a lot of other people are tackling. And I think it's over the next 3 to 5 years, though, eminently solvable. And then, that's really like, we'll see if we can do it, but I'm pretty optimistic.
Yeah, it's certainly a bright future that you paint, and I guess there's one other element to language learning that I talked to one of the team members at Preply about too, which is just around motivation. Right? There's having the pedagogical components in place for a great language teacher, but there's also the element of just keeping the learner motivated, because learning a language is difficult and it's easy to get discouraged. To what extent have you had to invest in that part of the problem at Speak?
We definitely are invested in it. But I would say that in general, we've always believed that the other problem is more important to solve first, because ultimately, if you can build a highly personalized education experience, then it's also, by definition, a much more relevant educational experience. And if you can improve relevance, and also this feeling of building a relationship, we believe those are better than gamification, which has been the traditional approach. And so for us, it's all about relevance and feeling like we actually understand you and that you're building some sort of relationship with this AI. And those, we believe, will be much more motivating factors into the future than, kind of these dopamine loops that mobile apps have traditionally optimized. That's been the strategy up until now. But motivation is an incredibly important part of learning in general.
Well, and you've called out one other key vector on which it sounds like you're highly differentiated from Duolingo. We've already talked about starting with speech versus starting with grammar and sort of sentences and gamified exercises. But this other element of, motivation is important, but if you just make the core learning experience really relevant and really compelling, then people will intrinsically be motivated. Whereas Duolingo has spent a lot of time building in these very effective gamification techniques to keep people engaged, but it's sort of taking an outside-in approach as opposed to an inside-out approach, and both can work, but two very different approaches to the problem.
Well, I think it's impressive that it's a meme at this point, but it's actually impressive and a testament to their product building capabilities that you have people with a 700-day streak that are saying out loud that they don't know how to speak the language whatsoever, but they still continue to use the app every day. Like, that in and of itself is impressive that they have built such a retentive product. But we believe like our aha moment is 100% around this feeling of like, oh, I can actually speak out loud now. This feels different.
Well, it's going to be exciting to see how it all plays out. Let's get to our lightning round. So I'm going to ask a series of rapid fire questions, and you can just give me quick responses. First one is the one I always ask, which is, what's the best part about working at Speak, and what's one thing that you would change or are working to change, since you're one of the co-founders?
Okay. One of the best parts of Speak is definitely just like the product we're building. And I'm going to cheat and say also the team that we're building. Those are like the two things that are by far the most motivating to me on a day-to-day basis. What's one thing I would change? It's a continuous battle of scaling the company while keeping it very agile, nimble, and feeling like there's not too many nodes and communication tax is high. So that's something that I'm like constantly trying to change about the company as it gets bigger and bigger.
I mean, I feel like that's an intractable problem to an extent, but I'm curious, has AI made that any easier?
I think you don't need as big of teams. I think
that's what I thought you'd say.
And then you have workflow tools. Like all of our tools are connected now, Notion, Linear, et cetera. And so if you're a new person, getting context is so much easier than it was a year ago.
Yeah, makes sense. What's your favorite foreign language and what do you love so much about it?
I can answer the opposite question, which is my least favorite. Korean is so hard to learn. And I really struggle, even though we've been operating there for so long, to learn it. But now we have Korean in the product. So I'm excited to practice it more.
Yeah. I mean, I mentioned earlier in the episode that I studied Chinese in college, specifically Mandarin. And one of the things our professor told us on the very first day of Chinese 101 was that for most Western speakers, it takes 4 times as long to learn a language like Mandarin or Japanese or Korean than it would a Romance language, just because it's so different. And so I can certainly empathize with you. It is a very difficult language. I was near fluent when I graduated, but at this point, it's been so long since I really used the language that it's definitely atrophied. So that's tough.
Well, we're releasing Chinese soon, so you can practice.
There you go. Yeah, I'll jump back in and brush up on my Mandarin skills. What's one decision you made early on at Speak that really changed the company's trajectory?
It has to be launching in Korea as our first market. That was definitely a very defining moment in terms of my lived experience for the next few years going to Korea all the time.
Yeah, I mean, you talked about it already, but that level of focus certainly unlocks a lot of value, and I can only imagine how it changed the culture in those early days. What's one advantage and one disadvantage of chasing a category king like Duolingo?
I wouldn't say that we are competing for the same thing. I think we're complementary goods, but they have made our lives a lot easier. And I would say when their stock was high, I would just say in general, we want their stock to be as high as possible, and generally are rooting for Duolingo, and because it actually does help us. It validates the market. I think the flip side is of course true too, which is that they are already so successful that there's of course always a question of where they end up long term relative to us.
I mean, this is generally what the best founders say, which is it's not a zero-sum game. You also pointed out, I can see how they're going after a very different target customer, right? You're focusing on the super intense Korean English language learner, and they're focusing on, in many cases, the casual American who just wants to learn a few words before they go on some trip over the summer. So two totally different target customers and two different products to serve those customers. But yes, obviously, if the large public company has a lofty valuation, that's a tailwind for you guys. And so not surprised to hear you say that. The last question I'll ask, and you sort of hinted at this earlier, but what's the single most profound way that you think AI will change how people learn? If we fast forward 5 years, 10 years, what do you think classroom learning is going to look like at that point? Or will it even be in a classroom at that point?
For any new technology, it is obviously something that will be very positive for the world and also will have a set of challenges, and AI is no different. But I think that education is one of the areas where it will just be clearly so good for the world. That I think people totally underestimate it. Like, I think it's one of the reasons why we can be very optimistic about the future, because I think that if you think about the fundamental value on the trajectory of someone's life and even who they become as a person, how the educational experience they had over the first, let's call it 20 years of their life went, is a huge determining factor in terms of the life that they're able to live later, and the quality of that life. It solves societal issues to improve your education system. And so I think we have like a seismic shift underway here. I think it will take time to trickle into schools. But I think it's a thing that I'm very, very optimistic about, because I think it's very clear, as we talked about earlier, that it will be possible to have this one-on-one educational experience, which doesn't mean teachers are going anywhere, but it means that they can focus on the things they do best, And I'm generally very optimistic about that future world that we'll live in.
Yeah, I am too. And there are a few things that are as transformative as education is. My wife is someone who's spent most of her career on youth education and workforce development, for the most part in East Africa. And it's been pretty incredible to see the impact that even her small nonprofit that's
100%.
still plugging away 20 years later can have. Well, this has been inspiring, Connor. Thanks for taking the time today. Any parting words that you want to leave the audience with before we wrap up?
Check out our product and send me feedback if you have it. But thanks so much for having me on.
Thanks for being on. It was my pleasure. Thanks again to RevenueCat for sponsoring this episode. If you're building a subscription app, you can use RevenueCat to power purchases, optimize paywalls, offer discounts, handle refunds, manage customer data, run A/B tests, generate insights, and unlock more revenue. I work with dozens of subscription apps, and most of them are already using RevenueCat to power their businesses. Learn more at revenuecat.com/subversive.